Russian forces to the south of Pokrovsk managed to capture the town of Novopavlivka in its entirety. On top of this, several developments have happened across the front line, similar in scale, where the Russians have managed to capture the town of Poltavka in the eastern outskirts of the first defensive line, made significant advances along the second line of defense near Oleksivka, with the push to the south of Pokrovsk gain control over Novopavlivka, and an additional push on the eastern flank of Kostiantynivka, breaching the defensive line from the southeast and northeast, where fighting continues over the defensive line on the outskirts of the city. The Russians made significant advances on the northwestern flank of Lyman on the supply lines leading to the city from the northwest. To the north of this, the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Pokrovsk and Rivka and an additional fortified position to the south of the settlement. As for the northern section in the Vovchansk direction and Sumy direction, there's been some developments as well. The Ukrainians managed to regain control over additional parts of Oleksivka, while the Russians managed to advance further within the Vovchansk section of the front line within the town itself, cutting off one of the supply lines leading into it from the southwest. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this update we cover 2 days worth of frontline developments. Within the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians continued advances along the railway area north of Chernshina, where following the initial push through the road to the east, where the managed to gain a foothold within Novopavlivka, with now this additional push, Russians have advanced along the railway, following the capture of fortifications to the west of Novopavlivka to cover the western entrance and enter into it from the western direction, and with additional pushes through the forest lines leading into Novopavlivka, the southern parts fell under Russian control, following which the Russians advanced to the northern outskirts of it, gaining full control of it, and fighting now continues along the railway towards the eastern outskirts of Pokrovsk. With the capture of the Shakhtarsky district that overlooked the railway area leading into Novopavlivka, the Russians now have a secure supply line through the railway area up towards the city, void of Ukrainian direct fire control over any of the parts. This leaves only the Ukrainian FPV drone, artillery, and so on long-range strikes that can limit but not stop Russian supplies. From this, we can see that the developments are changing the situation in the southern flank of Pokrovsk, as this leads to additional Russian supply lines heading into the city for the capture of it. The hardest parts the Russians have to face within Pokrovsk is the industrial area in the northwestern outskirts and the Shakhtarsky district, and with the capture of the majority of the Shakhtarsky district, the hardest parts are coming to an end, and this will lead to significant progress within the city in favor of the Russians if they deem it necessary to gain control over the city, because at that point they would have the advantage. The supplies would be limited into Pokrovsk, which would weaken the Ukrainian defenses. If the Ukrainians keep pouring reinforcements into the city, then it can act as an additional Bakhmut, where the Ukrainian forces can be dwindled down through the process of the Russians striking their positions during the entrance into the city, withdrawing from the city. The supplies themselves and the forces within the city, which are undersupplied at this point, would all be suffering more casualties than if they were to quickly capture the city. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, offensive operations continue along the first and second lines of defense. Along the first line of defense, the Russians captured the entirety of Poltavka. I did mention that you shouldn't be surprised if this did happen, because Deep State Map put the entirety of the town in a gray zone a couple of days back, which meant that the Russians had already infiltrated several parts of it, but they hadn't consolidated their gains yet. Now the Russians have fully captured the town, pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts, including the farm areas and the forest lines on the outskirts of the settlement, and the western parts of the town of Okhotnitshne, here in the first line of defense at the southern outskirts of it. With the capture of Poltavka, the Russians have gained a steady supply line leading up to the first line of defense from the southern direction. However, they still need to capture the actual fortifications before they are able to properly pass through the supplies from the first line of defense up to their forces operating at the rear of it. For this, the Russians have recently captured the fortifications just north of Okhotnitshne, which were the final fortifications east of the Encircle river line, which gives the Russians an ability to cross over the Encircle river line to pass through to the last fortifications here on the northern flank, which will allow the Russians to bypass the fortifications across the river line as well. Therefore, the Russian fighting will continue in the northern flank in the vicinity of the settlements here, just north of the fortifications, where the Russians will look to gain control over these settlements, gain control over the fortifications, and have an additional supply line leading up to the Russian forces operating in the area, from which they can start offensive operations towards Huliaipole itself. Getting control of the fortifications here into the north will open the road for the Russian forces to capture Vysoke, Zelenyi and Vesele in the south, which will open the road from Melinivka in the east to Huliaipole in the south. With this, the Russians will have two roads leading into Huliaipole from the south and from the east, and a third road from the rear of the first line of defense. While fighting also continues along the second line of defense to gain control over the entire highway leading into Huliaipole from the north. From this northern road, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of Oleksivka and the vicinity, the first lines leading up to the settlement from the east. With this, the Russians have fully secured the northern flank of the fortifications and the western flank of Sosnivka. A continuous push by the Russian forces towards the Vovcha River line from the south has the objective of cutting off the Ukrainian forces operating south of the Vovcha River line. To cut off the counterattacks the Ukrainians operating in the vicinity of Sishneve, Novoselivka, and Sosnivka to regain full control over these settlements and secure the southern bank of the Vovcha River line for further offensive operations along the second line of defense to cut off the highway leading into Huliaipole from the north. While a Russian capture of the highway is not just looking likely but imminent, it will be unlikely that the Russians will push from the highway itself down towards Huliaipole. Instead, it is more likely that the Russians would be pushing to cut off the northern highway isolating Pokrovsk from Huliaipole, and then pushing towards Huliaipole through the first line of defense from the southern, eastern, and northern directions, following which they'll push from Huliaipole up to connect their forces in the north by putting pressure on the Ukrainian defensive line, advancing through the fortifications rather than the highway itself, gaining control over which will cover the western flank of Huliaipole. If the fight over Huliaipole stretches out, then the Russian forces from the north will likely gain control over the fortifications along the northwestern flank to cut off the western highway, which would then isolate Huliaipole completely from its supplies. If it doesn't stretch out, the Ukrainians withdraw from it, then the Russians will quickly gain control of it and develop offensive operations to the north. In the northern section of the front line near Kostiantynivka, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional portions, gaining full control over what remains of the Dacha area to the east of the city and additional fortifications here to the northwest of Predachine. The Russians continue offensive operations to breach the first line of defense leading into Kostiantynivka just on the outskirts of the city, where we've previously seen the Russian forces attempting to gain a foothold in the eastern parts of the city. We're now seeing the second attempt from the southern flank, where the Russians are lining the front line from the northeast to the southeast with the objective of cutting off supplies to what remains of the settlements just outside the city to the south, while at the same time putting pressure on the eastern flank, which limits the supplies and reinforcements coming to the south. To develop offensive operations in the south to gain control over the residential area that connects with the city itself, and to gain control over the railway area, having additional supply lines heading into the southern flanks of Kostiantynivka. Further north in the direction of Lyman, the Russians managed to advance to the southeast, northwest, and further north of Novoselivka. Russian offensive operations here are through the forest patch areas to the southwest of Chendry-Holove, gaining a buffer zone between Chendry-Holove and the Ukrainian positions further west, with an additional push to cut off the road leading into Novoselivka from the western direction. This leaves the only supply lines coming into Novoselivka through the forest patch areas, as the Russians have managed to cut off the southern road as well. With this, Novoselivka has been operationally encircled, connected only to the forest patch area. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over Novoselivka, which will open up the roads down south towards Yarova, which will cut off Dobrisheve from supplies, which in extension cuts off Lyman from the northwestern supplies. The Russian FPV drones are already operating all around Lyman in this entire section north of the Sverska-Donetsk river line. At the same time, the Russians are working to physically cut off the northwestern roads. At the same time, they are striking the bridges across the Sverska-Donetsk river line. The objective is to limit as many supplies as possible from going into Lyman before they start storming the city itself. Fighting continues on the first line of defense, and they are closing in on the second line of defense, which is on the outskirts of the city, while they are striking the supply lines leading into it. Moving further north in the Borova section of the front line, the Russians gained control over additional parts of Kostiantynivka. The Ukrainians were pushed to the very outskirts of the settlement, where they have no longer any buildings, just a few forest patches just outside. They gained control over the first line to the east of it and an additional fortified position along the first line of defense as they continued advances along the defensive line to gain control over the fortifications in between Borova and Stepi and Kopenki. Objective is to gain control over the defensive line near Huliaipole. This will cut off the road supplying the Ukrainian forces from Borova towards their frontline settlements here in the east, to cut off the connection the Ukrainian forces have to the Sherebets river line. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians made 2 advances within Vovchansk and in the vicinity of it. Along the Encircle river line, the Russians have managed to advance within the forest patch area as they continue to reach into the crossings across the river line. The Russians have reached the outskirts of Huliaipole, where they're looking to gain control over the settlements to gain access to additional crossings through the river line, while at the same time they've managed to cut off one of the roads in the southwestern parts of Vovchansk, cutting off connection between Vovchansk and Sumy. The Russians' main push are going through the forest patch area where they can concentrate their infantry while hiding them within the forested areas for cover from Ukrainian FPV drones. This has allowed them to generate a significant amount of forces within the forest patch areas that then went and expanded into Vovchansk itself in the southern parts of the town. With this, the Russians will continue offensive operations through the forest patch area to reach into Poltavka, Sumy, and cut off the southwestern roads leading into Vovchansk before pushing into the central parts to cut off the southern highway and then gaining control over the positions along the Vovcha river line and the Encircle river line. Finally, in the northern section, in the Sumy region, the Ukrainians gain control of additional parts within Oleksivka, where heavy fighting continues. The Ukrainians have control over the western and southern road leading into the town, while the Russians have control over the northern and eastern roads leading into it. The Russian and Ukrainian forces are now somewhat even within the settlement, where both sides are pressuring each other to gain control over it. Heavy fighting is taking place within the settlement itself and on the roads leading into it, as the Russians and the Ukrainians are striking all supply lines to lead into the settlement. Therefore, you shall not underestimate the smallness of this town. The amount of forces being destroyed in this settlement is significant, and it is limiting the fighting of the entire section of the front line here in the Sumy region to this vicinity, where the Russians are looking to outflank the Ukrainians by attacking on a wider flank, and the Ukrainians have given up their wider flank attack and are storming it directly. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.